Today's discussion will be concerned with the history of the development of modern industry in India during the later half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, during the period when colonial conditions created a series of obstacles to the full-scale development of modern industry. This problem can be approached from two different angles. One of these approaches is to give you a list of the industries that had been growing since the middle of the 19th century, however slipshod the manner of their development was. You can trace the history of individual industries, the way they faced obstacles, the way they developed gradually, importing technology or devising technology. That is one kind of approach. The other, which is a more comprehensive approach of linking the problem with the overall political situation, the policies of the state, the manner in which the state policies were not adequately supportive of indigenous industrialization or a certain kind of industrialization which would have the ability to generate wealth more than the industries that had been growing had been able to do. We would opt for the second approach in order to get a sense of the long-term bottlenecks that had constricted the development of modern industry. And one of the main points which emerges from the discussions on the history of modern industrialization concerns the difference that historians or economic historians usually draw between complementary industrialization and competitive industrialization.
So what is the difference between complementary and competitive industrialization?
Actually, the use of these two words in the Indian context actually suggests the kind of industrialization that had happened in the later half of the 19th century by way of complementing the requirements of the colonial economy. Industries which had the potentiality to compete with British industries didn't grow. Only later in the 20th century, during the interwar years, such developments took place. But if you look at the bulk of the later half of the 19th century, when some modern industries started growing, all these industries were actually were complementing the basic interest of the dominant European or British firms in India in export-import trade, which is the reason why the development of modern industry, its history, requires to be situated against the larger backdrop of deindustrialization on the one hand and the very remarkable change in the commodity composition of India's export trade. Both these two developments happened hand in hand as a consequence of the opening up of the Indian economy since 1813, since the arrival of the free trade in India. We are all familiar with the history of deindustrialization, of how local industries, mainly handicrafts, but capable of producing fine textiles, which were showing signs of proto-industrialization because the East India Company's main interest was to profit from export of Indian textiles. They were mobilizing workers or textile weavers under factories and in order to minimize cost. So developments which were very similar to the kind of happenings in European economy in what is known as the proto-industrialization stage show the ability on the part of the local handicrafts, basically hand industry, to compete with international centers of production. Now, this was destroyed by the gradual opening up of the Indian economy and the large-scale import of finished goods from Britain once the Indian economy was opened up to private trading interests. By the middle of the 19th century, when you see the signs of development of certain modern industries, the textile industry had already been destroyed. At least the fine textile industry had undergone a complete destruction, except the coarse textile industry certainly survived in the remoter areas. So complementary industrialization led to a situation where certain modern industries certainly grew, but not in the same way as the Industrial Revolution had transformed some of the European economies. So the other important yardstick of comparison, of course, is the European experience. The large-scale industrialization that was made possible for superior technology, but before technology, what counted was the growing demand from within the domestic market or from the overseas markets. As a consequence of the demand push, the industries began to grow and grew to a point where historians saw the making of the Industrial Revolution. So if you keep this European experience in the backdrop, and if you look at the manner in which the Indian nationalists were very regularly complaining about India's lack of industrialization in the later half of the century as one of the main sources of Indian poverty, then you are able to locate the experience of India's limited industrialization against this larger backdrop. And it is in this context complementary industrialization acquires some importance, because the commodity composition of the Indian trade, which had undergone remarkable changes by the middle of the 19th century, by which India became the importer of finished goods and exporter of raw materials, would not actually allow a competitive industrialization in India. But a certain degree of complementary industrialization was necessary in order to keep the export trade going, because you need the railways to transport commodities from the port to the hinterland. You need the mining, because without coal you cannot run the railways. The British export-import trade had some interest in plantation as well, because tea or coffee became or figured as important export items. So the investment of these managing agencies, who began to diversify from their base in export-import trade into those areas which supported their foreign trade business, ultimately were responsible for what we call the complementary industrialization. Because they were not interested in investing their wealth or money in those sectors which were likely to, or which had the possibility of competing with the finished good industries of England, with which they were very closely tied. So complementary industrialization actually underlines certain long-term constraints on development of modern industry in India. With the railways, of course, came the possibility of a large-scale industrialization centering around the railways. Once again, the European experience provides you with the comparative index, because in many of the relatively backward regions in Europe, where industrialization had started late, instead of a consumer industry like textile, the railways became the prime mover. The railways became the leading sector, as historians describe them, because the railways, once a huge amount of investment goes to the railways begin to generate a huge amount of demand for certain kind of industries which cater to the railways: steel, locomotives, wagons, a whole range of ancillary industries which grew along with the railways, changed the industrial map of many of the backward regions of Europe which had started late, but which managed to pick up through railway-centered industrialization. So one would imagine that in the Indian context too, when the railways began to expand from the middle of the 19th century, when investment in the railways began to reach a certain peak from 1860s onwards, this would lead to a greater amount of multiplier effect.
So what is the multiplier effect?
But that's exactly what I was suggesting, that you are making an investment, and that investment leads to the development of other industries as well. So some of the pre-existing industries would derive benefits from this investment, and new industries would grow. For example, once a huge amount of investment went into the Indian railways, but this entire railway capital actually came from England. There was hardly any attempt by the colonial state or by those companies which were investing in the railways to mobilize the necessary capital from within India. They imported the entire capital from England. But the amount of this investment turned out to be very high, because we know from the history of immigration of capital from Britain to the overseas land that during this period in the later half of the century, the Indian railways had attracted the bulk of the outgoing British capital. Later, of course, at the turn of the century, the situation would change, but it would change because of the kind of constraints that colonial relationship or the colonial economy imposed on the possibilities of more comprehensive industrialization. This is where the issue of multiplier effect comes in, because if you take the investment in the railways as a point of entry, then a huge investment in the railways would certainly lead to the demand for rails, the demand for wagons, etc. It would also generate a heavy demand for coal. So coal mining had already been existing, so some of the old industries were likely to derive benefit from this investment, and some new industries were likely to develop because new technology was required, engineering skills were required, engineering materials were required, wagons were required. Nothing of that sort happened in India as a consequence of this huge amount of investment that British capital was making. The only purpose was to explore the interior market so that the imported commodities could reach the interior market so easily. It was not unnatural that the Manchester Chamber of Commerce, which actually was the spokesman of the British textile interest, actually campaigned for India's railway expansion. But over time, as you can realize now, that the Indian railways became a cushion for British capital. Capital could be invested in a more secure environment where political control ensured safety of profit, where the colonial state stood as a guarantor of a minimum profit for all these investors, regardless of whether these railway companies were functioning efficiently or not. They were assured by the minimum return that they were expecting from this investment. In addition, all the British capital goods industries which had started facing competition in the American market or the European market, with the rise of the hitherto backward regions, with the rise of Germany, for example, as an industrial power, the British steel was facing stiff competition in the European market. Many of these European states were imposing tariff on the free import of British capital goods in order to protect their industries. So it is in this context that the investment of Indian railways acquired a special meaning for those British industries which were profiting immensely from the cushion effect of this huge investment. The multiplier effect was felt by British industries rather than by Indian industries, largely because of the reason that many of these railways, under the instruction of the colonial state, issued certain store rules by which they were actually prohibited from undertaking production of steel locally or undertaking production of locomotives locally. There were several attempts, in fact, but both in the steel sector or in the locomotive sector, where local investment or local production would have reduced the import costs substantially, would have made import substitution possible, and therefore it would have benefited the railway companies quite substantially. Store rules of the railways under the directive of the colonial government prevented the development of such industries. So we can see that the multiplier effect that was likely to accrue from this kind of investment didn't result. So all along the later half of the 19th century, development of steel industry was very slipshod. In a country like India, development of steel industry, which in fact began to grow only after independence with the establishment of public sector steel plants on a large scale under the rubric of 5-year plans, the real breakthrough happened. Until then, except for the Tata Industries or a few steel companies growing during the interwar period during the 1930s and 40s, there was not much to show. The experiment of the Bengal iron, which was intended to supply to the railways or supply to the government, didn't succeed in the late 19th century, largely because of the reason that the railways did not generate enough demand for these the steel sector, even though some of these companies did try to produce steel locally. And also the government didn't actually protect them. The government didn't buy steel produced by the Bengal Iron. They continued to import steel from Britain. If you shift your focus from the steel sector to the textile sector during the latter half of the 19th century, you see a slightly different scenario. And this is where the regional divergence in industrialization comes in. You have a very important work by Professor Romeo Bakchi called The Private Investment in India, in which he shows how the industrial scene or industrial situation in India had regional differences. In eastern India, where British capital was most powerful, all of these industries were export-oriented industries, catering to the needs of complementary industrialization. You have investment in the railway sector, you have investment in the mining, you have investment in plantation, you have investment in jute processing, not always finished jute. Some of the companies or mills, of course, produce finished jute or jute products, but in most cases they produce threads, and the finished goods were produced in Scotland. But jute, as you know, was a very important item for producing gunny bags, which were extremely important as an export trade. And the control of most of these export-oriented industries lay in the hands of European business firms, managing agencies as they were called. But if you look at the Western Indian situation, you see some amount of difference where Parsis initially in Bombay and some Gujaratis started investing in textile industry. The Parsis were producing mainly cotton yarn, which were exported to China. They were some of the earliest collaborators of the British. They had once invested and had prospered as a ship-owning merchant community, but later on, they became what is known as collaborator traders or comprador trading group. But around the middle of the 19th century, some of these Parsi entrepreneurs were also investing in mills, cotton textile mills, which produced yarn, and this yarn was exported to China. But from about 1870s, a group of Gujarati merchants who had profited immensely from the cotton boom, that temporary period when huge amount of raw cotton was exported to England, and unlike in Eastern India where the British were controlling even the arteries of internal trade in Western India, they had a degree of dependence on local trading communities because of the later entry of the British into the region. These people who had profited immensely from cotton trade accumulated wealth, and once they found that prospects of cotton trade had become bleak, with the resumption of supply from the United States, they started investing their money in local textile production, producing finished goods, trying to cater to the domestic market. So in Western India, you see a difference where the complete elimination of Indian trading communities didn't happen, where Indian trading communities continued to dominate at least certain sectors, where Indian trading communities found an interest in investment in certain industries like textile, which even though started mainly as an export industry, but which had an orientation for the domestic market, unlike in Western India where most of the industries were export oriented. So, over time, these mills began to grow in number, but throughout the latter half of the 19th century, you see how these textile mills had to struggle with the many constraints that the colonial policy, tariff policy, had imposed on them. If the colonial state, following some examples from Europe, had imposed tariff or had protected these firms or these newly born textile mills, they would have prospered more.
Sir, why were these Indian textile industries not protected?
One simple answer, of course, is that one of the main import items was textile. I mean, You have all these agencies who are importing finished textiles. But so if this textile industry had to grow, it had to grow in the teeth of a very stiff competition with the textile sector in Britain. In spite of the stranglehold that British textile had been able to establish over the Indian economy, over the Indian market, the local textile industry showed signs of development. They were catering to the interior markets, producing coarse textiles, and there was enough indication of these industries emerging as the possible competitor. So the demand for protection arose from nationalist circles. The nationalists came up with the demand that these Indian textile industry needed to be protected from foreign competition. And as far as the colonial state was concerned, the tariff was a very important fiscal option at that stage, because the state was continuously in a state of financial crisis. And there was a need for the state to try with the import tariff as a possible measure of taxation, which would actually give the colonial state a measure of financial stability. So there were moments when the Indian administrators or the Anglo-Indian officials in Calcutta contemplated introduction of tariff not as a protective measure, but as a fiscal measure. But whenever such measures were contemplated by the Indian officials, there was agitation in England, and the English government, fearful of losing votes in the Midland counties where the Lancashire lobby was very powerful, was not willing to allow the Indian government to go ahead with their tariff plan. Ultimately, in 1890s, when the government, Indian government, the colonial Indian government had to impose tariff as a fiscal measure, there was a countervailing excise imposed on the Indian textile industry. That if you are actually importing textile at a certain rate, taxing imported textile at a certain rate, the same route would apply by way of excise tax on local production. But the importance of tariff as a fiscal measure, the protective potential of tariff as a fiscal measure was realized after the First World War. The First World War saddled the Indian government, the colonial government, with financial problems, and in order to get away from these financial problems, they found tariff as the most attractive option. And once tariff was introduced and the rate was increased incrementally over time, we find that the Indian textile industry pushed out Lancashire out of their most protected market in India. Even the Indian textile was able to compete with the Japanese textile during this interwar period because of the protection that the Indian textile managed to derive from tariff that was introduced mainly as a fiscal measure.
Sir, did this protectionism in the interwar period help in the development of other industries also?
Yes, if you actually look at the record of steel industry, for example, TISCO was established or registered in 1907, but most of its developments happened during the 1920s. From 1917-18, certainly during the wartime, some of these industries had started developing because of the problems that had arisen in the regular supply of some of the essential commodities to India. So that was an opportunity for some of the Indians to set up local industries. But during the interwar year, because of tariff that was imposed on imported commodities, local industries had begun to grow. It is not that these local industries were controlled by Indian capital. British capital also controlled them. Paper industry that had begun to develop during the interwar years was controlled by British capital. You have, for example, cement, which was initially under British capital. It was only in the jute sector that we come across the gradual entry of indigenous capital by way of the Marwaris, who had been jute brokers and who are becoming important entrepreneurs in the jute industry. In the steel industry, apart from Tata Industries, you have Mysore Steel in southern India, but the most impressive record, of course, was that of the TISCO, Tata Steel. It's really picked up, or its production really picked up. It became an important firm only during the interwar period. It is also in the same period that we come across the gradual elimination of the kind of control that the Lancashire textile interest had over the Indian market. So certainly the kind of protection that was derived from tariff as a fiscal measure after the war in a state of financial crisis gave a new impetus for local industries to grow. Some of these local industries continued to be controlled by British capital, but in certain areas we come across the gradual emergence of indigenous capital as well. So if we are actually trying to sum up the entire discussion, we can clearly see certain stages. In the early part of the 19th century, we see how the old industries were destroyed. But this is an experience which is very common. In all the major industrially developed countries, old industries declined and new industries grew. The development of modern industries, however, came to be blocked by colonial economic interests, which were reflected, as we have suggested, in the commodity composition of India's trade. And that became a long-term constraint on development of consumer industries like textiles until major changes happened in the government policy in the early part of the 20th century. The same can be said about steel, because the railways, which were the main consumers of such items in the later half of the 19th century, the period when the railway expansion was reaching its peak, didn't consume Indian steel, imported most of its materials from England, but it was only later, during the interwar period, protected by the tariffs. But tariffs were not introduced as a protective measure, basically as a fiscal measure. But this is also the time when you come across the consolidation of Indian business interest around export-import trade, around local industries. So there was an urgency on the part of the colonial state, which was facing large-scale agitation organized by the Congress, which was receiving support from business interest, to give some amount of concession to local business lobbies, to local business interest. So the situation from 1920s onwards began to change because of the government's own financial problems, as well as the government's need to arrive at some kind of consensus with the Indian business interests. So the approach that we had deliberately taken was to locate the history of modern industry in the larger backdrop of political change, the larger backdrop of the kind of problems that modern industrialization in India faced, the way problems created by colonial economy were responsible for what we have labeled as incomplete development of industries, or industrialization, which for some time at least, which till the early 20th century was basically a complementary industrialization, a process which actually supported the export-import trade.